We've seen in the last few episodes that there seem to be a number of good reasons for thinking that physics is not heading in the right direction. In several episodes before that, we saw the same story with astronomy. In several episodes before that, we saw that biology is also on a very poor footing. And in others, we saw that chemistry, at least as far as its involvement with origin of life is concerned, is floundering, although other branches of chemistry seem to be doing well. On the whole, that doesn't look like a very good story for science. But it's not just in science where many disciplines seem to be in the doldrums. It's not just in science where piles of meaningless papers are being churned out. What are usually called the humanities are in an even worse state. The problem there is that none of it can hide behind the smokescreen of incomprehensible mathematics. It's open to scrutiny if anyone bothers to look. The whole problem went public when a Cambridge University PhD proudly presented her dissertation on X. The title of her thesis was Olfactory Ethics, the Politics of Smell in Modern and Contemporary Prose. In the abstract, she tells us, its aim is to establish smell's application in creating and subverting gender, class, sexual, racial and species power structures. Now, when I was at school in the 1950s, it was common to find essays in newspapers and magazines which might have looked at something vaguely like that. But this is a PhD thesis, and from Cambridge University. I would have expected something of real substance. Comments on X seem to suggest that other people would have expected some real substance too. One described it as the ultimate bullshit degree, a PhD about why describing smells is racist. Another said, there is nothing deep here. Who cares? The most banal observations imaginable, dressed up in enough jargon to costume play as scholarship. Another said, this woman just received a PhD from one of the so-called elite universities for a thesis claiming that describing smells is racist. Yes, you read that right. The core of the research? If you say someone stinks, people like them less. A concept any child learns from cartoons at age 4. At least this is an eye-opener. Academia is dead, and we can no longer take those so-called elite universities seriously. Another noted, this is the most non-essential drivel I've seen in a long time. This isn't work, it's ego placating for the privileged. And the whole situation was explained by a scholar who said, people mocking the PhD thesis on smells have no idea how infinitely much of this stuff there is out there already. There are seas of it, written to get jobs, read by no one. The problem with this one is that the poor young lady was foolish enough to make her thesis public. So it did get read, and at least 1 million people on X now have an inkling of how utterly pathetic academia has become, particularly its elite establishments. Well, we saw something of how the most prestigious universities in America were attracting attention for anything but academic excellence in episode 110. We met Ayaan Hirsi Ali, marvelling at the collapse of Western civilization as seen at its most prestigious universities. So here we see one of the most prominent of the so-called new atheists, former soulmate of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris and co., pointing to the truth. The disaster has been turning away from the core of Western civilization, turning away from the God of the Bible, turning away from Christ. We have deliberately turned away from and spurned the wisdom given to us in the Bible. The Bible tells us that the basis of society is the family. God said, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." And Jesus said, "For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." And God tells us why He wants permanent and faithful unions of man and wife. "And wherefore one? That he might seek a godly seed. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth." God made man and woman differently. The design of a woman, physically and mentally, is based on bearing and raising the godly children that He designed her to produce. The design of a man is totally different. Physically and mentally, a man is designed to protect and provide for his wife and children. God's instruction to men and women are very different. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be unto their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. And God tells us why He gives such instructions. "Oh, that there were such an heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." Everything He tells us to do is for our own benefit, that it might be well with us and with our children. But today we're living in the Enlightenment. We know better than God. Our society has decided that there is no real difference between men and women, and that bearing and raising of children is of little value to society anyway. And that utter nonsense is being promoted and enforced with programs of DEI. Diversity, equity and inclusivity. The anti-children drive has been a disaster for the whole of Western society. Leaving success to ability and merit does not lead to the goals of DEI, so they have to be enforced. Let's see what a modern feminist has to say about the effect of DEI on our universities.
We are in the middle of a great social experiment. The sex ratios of many important institutions in the West are changing, and few institutions more dramatically illustrate this shift than academia. Only in the past few decades have women started to outpace men at all levels. New graduate degrees, new faculty members. Today, an institution once led and populated almost entirely by men is increasingly led and populated by women. Because men and women, on average, have different traits, tendencies, and priorities, this change in sex ratios has changed and will continue to change the nature of the modern university. A 2018 study of over 4,000 full-time college students on issues related to free speech on campus and diversity and inclusion found that 71% of men reported that protecting free speech is more important than promoting an inclusive society. 59% of women said promoting an inclusive society is more important than protecting free speech. 58% of men said that it is never acceptable to shut down speakers or to try to prevent them from delivering their remarks. 58% of women said that it was sometimes or always acceptable. A 2022 paper in which 574 undergraduates, graduates, and PhD students were asked to allocate 100 points towards 5 different academic priorities found that men allocated more points toward academic freedom and advancing knowledge than women, and women allocated more points towards social justice and emotional well-being than men. A 2020 paper in which 140 academic faculty at colleges and universities in the United States completed the same 5-point allocation task and found that women allocated more points to social justice and emotional well-being than men, and consequently had fewer points to allocate to advancing knowledge, academic rigor, and academic freedom. Male researchers were more likely to specify scientific progress or the advancement of knowledge as the aim of their research. Female researchers were more likely to specify societal progress or external usefulness as the aim of their research. Female scholars were more likely than their male counterparts to report that creating a better society inspires their work and to place higher value on research that has benefited society. A 2021 survey of over 468 psychology professors from the top 100 universities in the US found that when asked whether scholars should be completely free to pursue research questions without fear of institutional punishment for their research conclusions, among men, the majority, 60% said yes. Among women, the majority, 59%, said it's complicated, and 39% said yes, and only 0.6% said no. When asked whether scientists should prioritize the truth or social equity goals when the two conflict, among men, the majority prioritized truth. Women, on the other hand, the majority said it's complicated, and 43% prioritized the truth. 4.8% prioritized social equity. The overall theme of these differences is that men are more committed than women to the pursuit of truth as the raison d'etre of science, when women are more committed to various moral goals, such as equity, inclusion, and the protection of vulnerable groups. Consequently, men are more tolerant of controversial and potentially offensive scientific findings being pursued, disseminated, and discussed, and women are more willing to obstruct or suppress science perceived to be potentially harmful or offensive. Put more simply, men are relatively more interested in advancing what is empirically correct, and women are relatively more interested in advancing what is morally desirable. As the population of academia shifts from one dominated by men to one that is more balanced or disproportionately female, support for including moral and harm concerns into scientific and publishing process is likely to increase, and support for academic freedom is likely to decline. Some of the most drastic developments over the past 25 years share a common theme. They reflect the priorities of women. Some of these priorities include the introduction of diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI, committees and offices on university campuses, DEI programming and degrees, and a 34% increase in the spending of DEI budgets from 2014 to 2018. The introduction of DEI commitment statements as a required part of job application materials for faculty members, which are more common in more female-dominated social science jobs than in more male-dominated STEM jobs. An increase over the past 7 years in the number of academics targeted for sanction for their scholarship and teaching, and often due to the harm concerns about the content of their teaching or scholarship. The addition of extra scientific moral concerns to the evaluation criteria for publications and retractions by journals such as Nature Human Behavior and Nature Communications. The introduction of safe spaces and trigger warnings on college campuses. The requirement now made by large professional societies such as the Society for the Personality and Social Psychology that presenters explain how their work advances equity and anti-racism, and the evaluation of presentations based on their ability to achieve these goals. Growing concerns about coddling the free speech crisis and increasing censorship and self-censorship on college campuses. These changes reflect rising prioritization of egalitarianism, potentially at the expense of merit-based evaluations of science. To wit, desire for social equity encourages women to pursue academia. A changing sex composition affects ideological tilt and intellectual priorities of academia, and these new priorities further attract women and others with left-wing political priorities. But regardless of whether the equity or the estrogen came first, the growing percentage of women is likely to continue to influence the priorities of science and higher education. Those that believe that the purpose, the lodestar of science, should be the pursuit of truth might find these trends worrisome. But it would be unethical and futile to attempt to roll back the enormous social gains women have made. The men's club era of academia is over. A new and more female-oriented era is here for the foreseeable future.
The overall effect is the suppression of truth and free speech in favour of DEI's political correctness. This has had a profound influence on not only the staff of universities, but on the students also. As teaching becomes more and more about political correctness and less about truth, men are seeing less and less value in spending time on what they see as little more than worthless propaganda. And this accelerates the headlong feminization of academia. Already only about 40% of students are male, and universities are almost in panic mode as they try to prevent it dropping to 30%. Amy Wax is a professor at Penn State who has lived through the feminization of academia. She's not a feminist and dared to tell the truth about it.
Well, I mean, I'm on the record as saying that the feminization of the academy has been a total disaster, okay? Because what it has meant is that the values of the nursery and the kindergarten have now been elevated to the paramount considerations, and the old traditional and traditionally masculine values of truth-seeking, of argumentation, of reason and evidence and objectivity have been downgraded. I mean, you know, it's one thing to say, well, we need to open these institutions to women. And I think fundamental fairness provides a very strong basis for doing that. We should open these institutions to talent, whatever form it takes. And that applies also to different ethnicities and different races. But it's quite another to say, well, now we're going to let the interests of women or the values that women, elevate, we're going to sort of let those become the paramount guiding values. We're going to displace all of the old practices and all of the old touchstones in favor of these. I mean, that wasn't part of the deal. That shouldn't be part of the deal. And you say, well, women's tiers rule the day. Well, that just begs the question of why men let women's tiers rule the day. There was a time, wasn't that long ago, all right, where men said to women, I'm sorry, but if you think that the values of the nursery and the kindergarten of, making everybody feel good and included and warm and yummy, that those are going to become the paramount values of the reigning values of the academy, I'm sorry, but no, we are not going to give in to that. We are going to resist that. We have good and sufficient reason for pushing back, because over hundreds and hundreds of years of struggle and analysis and effort, we have developed these post-Enlightenment standards, and we have them for good and sufficient reason. They have yielded all the great achievements and accomplishments of civilization. We believe in them. We are willing to defend them, and we're not going to let you defeat them. In other words, why are men not standing up to women? They used to.
Amy Wax was reviled and censured, and as we saw at the beginning, the worthless, politically correct drivel now pouring out of academia is unsustainable. Research costs money. If research only produces worthless drivel, then it's not justifiable. And it's not only the research which is of disappointing quality. We saw Ayaan Hirsi Ali and her concern for the pathetic quality of their students.
I look at these universities, the most illustrious universities of the West, and you've all shared with me images of young women draped in kefirs, the symbol of Hamas, performing the Muslim prayer. And tell me if those kids are not morally and utterly lost. And Queers for Palestine. So while you and I and Steven Pinker and all of those wonderful people were locked up in our ivory towers, let's ask ourselves what was happening on the ground, because in the last 6 decades, we pretty much demonized Christianity and the teachings of Christianity out of the public space, out of school, out of universities. And a vacuum occurred, and that vacuum is now being filled, as G.K. Chesterton said, not because people have come to reason, but because now they'll believe in anything. And I really mean this in a serious way. I look at those young people in their 20s, in their teens, in their 30s, and right now they're being offered these messages of moral frameworks that they're embracing that are cultish, that are based on fear, that are nihilistic, and that are dead end. Stand up to those people in Columbia and Harvard and Penn U. The way I would like to put it is, you have this amazing civilization, you have these amazing societies, and it is pretty frightening to see that the best and the brightest are converting to the mind virus of wokeism and the mind virus of Islamism. And we have failed the next generation by taking away from them that moral framework and telling them it's nonsense and false, but also not protecting them then from the external forces that come in for their hearts, their minds, and their souls. Again, the assumption was reason and enlightenment and humanism is simply going to emerge from education. The higher your level of education, the more reasonable you are. Now, what we see on display in our universities is the very opposite. So the people who are in charge of universities, people who are in charge of educating and developing young minds, are looking on and thinking, what the heck is going on here? And that is not the right attitude.
She was talking about the pathetic goings-on at Harvard, MIT, and Penn State universities, with students rioting, wallowing in threats and violence, and setting up tent villages on the campuses. The antisocial antics were so disturbing that the presidents of those universities were asked to explain what was going on to the United States Congress. These 3 worthy ladies had no worthwhile responses, no worthwhile plans for bringing order and sanity to the domains over which they were responsible. None of them could see what erstwhile atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali could see, that the problem is due to the rejection of the core values which had made those institutions great. The biblical Christianity on which they were founded. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead thee cause thee to err, and destroy the way of thy paths. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, Please like, subscribe, and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find the link on my channel banner and in the description below.